Welcome to Life Stories. Have you ever given everything for someone, only to have it thrown back in your face with a single hurtful sentence? Imagine spending decades loving, sacrificing, and building a life around someone, only for them to ask you to stay in your lane. This is the story of a mother who faced the cruelest rejection on the day she thought she'd finally be celebrated. The day her only son was getting married. She thought she'd be part of the joy, the planning, but instead she became invisible. What happens when the people you love most choose to ignore your worth? How do you cope when your world crumbles at the hands of those you'd sacrifice everything for? Stick around, because this is a story of pain, self-discovery, and the unexpected power of standing your ground. Let me take you back to the moment everything began to change. The kitchen had never felt as still as it did that Sunday afternoon. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting soft shadows across the freshly cleaned countertops. Helen had spent years making this space hers, each mug in the cabinet placed just so, the tea bags organized in neat rows, and the kitchen table always cleared before dinner. It was her sanctuary, the place where she could sit, breathe, and for a moment forget the weight of the world. Ethan, her only son, sat across from her, tapping his foot nervously. She noticed the way his hands trembled as they held his phone, but it wasn't until he looked up at her that she realized something big was coming. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm getting married." Madison said yes. Her heart stopped. There, in that simple, unremarkable moment, the world seemed to tilt. Her baby boy, the child she had raised, the boy she had given everything for, was getting married. The joy she felt was almost physical, a rush of warmth that spread from her chest outward, like a secret she hadn't dared whisper aloud. She had been waiting for this moment, not just for him, but for herself. For a few precious seconds, she allowed herself to imagine the wedding, the flowers, the dress, the cake. Maybe she could even step back into the world she had left behind years ago, the world of bridal planning. Her hands itched at the thought, the instinctive pull to organize, to create something beautiful, to make the day everything it should be. "That's wonderful, Ethan," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so happy for you both." She smiled, and it was a smile that stretched too wide. She could already see herself in the front row, beaming with pride, arranging the flowers, choosing the perfect venues, the perfect caterers. She was ready to return to the world she had once loved, but then he said something that stopped her in her tracks. "Madison already has a vision for everything. She's been following this planner on Instagram. It's all very modern, minimalist, very us. We don't really want to go with the traditional route, and we figured it'd be easier if she just handled all of it." Helen blinked, confusion twisting in her gut. She tried to process it, but it was as if the floor beneath her had suddenly turned to ice. She had imagined playing a role in this, not just as a mother, but as someone who knew weddings like the back of her hand, who had spent over 30 years crafting flawless, unforgettable days for brides. And yet here she was, a bystander in her own son's life. Her smile faltered, but she couldn't let him see it. Not yet. "I see," she said slowly. "But Ethan, it's a family event. I thought maybe I could help, just a little. I've still got my contacts, my experience. I could offer suggestions." "That's the thing, Mom," he interrupted, looking uncomfortable now, shifting in his seat. "Madison thinks it'd be best if you just stayed in your lane." The words hit her like a slap, the force of it reverberating through her chest. It was as if the air had left the room entirely, and her breath caught in her throat. "Stay in my lane?" she repeated, her voice too high, too forced, as if she couldn't quite comprehend what he was saying. "Yeah," he nodded, not meeting her eyes. "She thinks it'll just be easier if, well, no offense. It's just, you know how she is. She just wants to avoid confusion." A chill swept through her, and in that moment, she felt more like a stranger than a mother. Every ounce of her pride, the pride she had carried with her for decades, crumbled with those words. She excused herself quickly, mumbling something about a call with an old colleague, but she couldn't hide the hurt in her eyes. She needed space, time to breathe. Sitting on her bed that night, the lights off and the window cracked open, she stared at the darkening sky. The world outside was moving on, but she was stuck, paralyzed by the sharp sting of rejection. The dream of a mother standing proudly beside her son, planning his wedding, was slipping through her fingers like sand. But as the silence stretched on, she didn't cry. She lay still, as if trying to memorize the taste of the hurt. She told herself it was just a misunderstanding, that maybe Madison hadn't meant it the way it sounded. Maybe Ethan was just trying to avoid a fight. But deep down, she knew that this was just the beginning of a much bigger shift, one she wasn't prepared for. The next few weeks passed in a haze. Brief check-ins from Ethan, shallow conversations, and silence from Madison. Not a word, not a call, as if she had never been a part of their lives at all. Then came the lunch invitation. Madison, along with a few friends and her mother, had invited Helen to join them at a local cafe. Just to talk wedding vibes, Madison had said in her text, and Helen had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that this would be her chance to prove she still had a place in this world. She dressed carefully, choosing a soft peach blouse and gold earrings. She even brought along a folder with carefully printed inspiration boards, ideas, not demands. When she arrived, she was greeted with a polite but empty smile from Madison, who barely looked up from her phone. The conversation turned to the wedding almost immediately, and Helen gently opened her folder, offering a few ideas she thought might be helpful. Madison didn't even glance at the papers. "That's okay," she said dismissively, not looking up. "We're going for something more modern. Nothing too traditional. We're really into the whole minimalist thing right now. We already have a planner lined up. Someone young. She's really cool. She's all over TikTok." Helen sat there, holding her folder in her lap, as if time had stopped. The words felt like a slap, but there was nothing to do but swallow the sting. Madison's friends giggled, exchanging knowing glances. The cruelty was subtle, but it hit its mark with devastating precision. That night, Helen sat alone in her car, parked in the driveway, staring blankly at the steering wheel. She had never felt more invisible in her life. She thought about calling Ethan, but what would she say? That his fiancé had humiliated her in front of everyone? That she had been made to feel like a relic of the past? But she said nothing. Instead, she went inside, made a cup of tea, and pretended everything was fine. Days passed, and she continued to be left out. No more phone calls, no more invites. Her attempts to connect fell on deaf ears. She tried to make her peace with it, but every passing day chipped away at her, leaving her more isolated. Then, one evening, she received the final blow, a quiet, almost dismissive response from Ethan, letting her know that Madison had already planned everything. The wedding she had envisioned for so long was no longer a dream. It had become a performance, one she wasn't even invited to watch. And so, Helen made a decision that would change everything. She quietly withdrew the money she had saved over the years for Ethan's wedding, a small fortune that had been set aside for the day she'd always dreamed of. She didn't need to fight, didn't need to scream. She simply walked away. A week later, Ethan came to her with a look of guilt in his eyes. He asked what had happened to the money, and Helen simply replied, "I wasn't invited to be part of this anymore, Ethan. I stayed in my lane." The words came out with a calm she didn't recognize in herself. The wedding was doomed, not because of a missing planner or a few misguided choices, but because of something much deeper. The family she had once been part of had fallen apart because it had never truly valued what she had to offer. Would they realize the cost of their arrogance too late? Would Ethan ever see how far he had pushed her away? Or would he remain trapped in a world built on image, with no room for the love that had always been right in front of him? What happens when a mother decides to let go? And let them face the consequences of their choices. Helen hadn't heard from Ethan in days. The silence between them felt thick, suffocating, as though the space they once shared was slowly being swallowed by an invisible wall. Each time her phone buzzed, her heart would leap in her chest, only to sink when she saw it wasn't him. Her fingers moved absent-mindedly over the pages of an old bridal magazine she'd pulled from the shelf, though she barely saw the pictures. The images were nothing more than blurred colors to her now, memories of a life she no longer had a place in. She closed the magazine with a soft sigh and stared out the window. It was then that the knock came. Helen's heart skipped. For a moment she thought maybe it was Ethan, coming to explain himself, to beg her forgiveness. But when she opened the door, it wasn't him. Madison stood there, her arms crossed, wearing a tight smile that barely reached her eyes. The sight of her felt like an intrusion, like someone had come to rub salt into an open wound. "Hi, Helen," she said, her voice unusually sweet, like a stage performer reading lines from a script. "I know things have been tense between us. I just wanted to come over and make sure everything's okay." Helen stared at her for a moment, unsure whether to let her in or slam the door shut. She had spent days wrestling with her emotions, trying to piece together what had happened and how her relationship with Ethan had shattered so quickly. She had thought that, maybe, just maybe, Madison would come to her senses and offer a genuine apology. But this felt different. "Everything's fine," Helen replied, her voice colder than she intended. "Come in, I guess." Madison stepped inside, glancing around at the familiar surroundings. Helen noticed how she seemed to be taking it all in. The worn armchair by the fireplace, the faded photographs on the mantelpiece, all the things she had long ago given up for the sake of family. Madison's eyes lingered for a moment too long on a family portrait of Helen and Ethan, a time before the rift, before everything changed. "I know this must be hard," Madison said after a long pause, sitting down on the couch, her voice soft now, almost as if she were trying to convince herself more than Helen. "But I need you to understand something." Helen's heart beat a little faster. She already knew where this was going, but she couldn't quite bring herself to stop her. "I'm just trying to help Ethan," Madison continued. "He's been under a lot of pressure. You know how he is. Always trying to keep the peace." Helen's jaw clenched, but she kept quiet. She could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but she'd learned long ago that speaking in anger only gave people like Madison more ammunition. Instead, she sat back and waited. "You see," Madison went on, seemingly unaware of the tension in the room, "I just don't want things to get messy. I don't want Ethan to feel like he has to choose between us, and I know you don't want that either." The words stung, and Helen's chest tightened. Ethan had never been asked to choose between them. Not once. But this was different. Madison had already made her decision. Helen felt the knot of frustration in her stomach. For the first time in weeks, the floodgates of her emotions began to crack open. The years of devotion, the love she'd poured into Ethan, all seemed so small now, reduced to nothing by someone who barely knew the meaning of family. "I'm not asking for a battle, Helen," Madison added, lowering her gaze as if trying to soften the moment. "I just think we need some space to do things our way." Helen could hardly believe what she was hearing. She wasn't asking for anything, wasn't demanding any part of the wedding. All she had wanted was to be acknowledged, to have a place in her son's life when it mattered most. And now, here she was, sitting across from the woman who had essentially erased her from that very life, and being told, with a smile, that it was for the best. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped Helen before she could stop it. She wasn't sure whether it was a laugh of disbelief or resignation, but it echoed in the room like a distant warning. Madison looked taken aback, but Helen didn't care. She stood, pacing for a moment, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "You have no idea, do you?" Helen's voice cracked. "You've never understood what it's like to give everything for someone, to build your whole world around them, only to have it thrown aside like it was nothing. This wedding, this whole thing, it isn't about love. It's about control. You want to control everything, including my place in Ethan's life." Madison's eyes flashed, but she didn't respond. Helen's heart hammered in her chest. She had let this go on long enough. She had buried her feelings, pushed down every ounce of hurt and resentment. But now it was all bubbling to the surface, and she couldn't keep pretending. "I've spent my whole life giving, Madison," she said, her voice shaking. "I've put my dreams aside, swallowed my pride, and you know what? It wasn't for nothing. But it wasn't for you either. It was for my son, and you can't just take that away." Madison stood up, the mask slipping for a second as she looked at Helen, her face hardening. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said coldly, her voice thin with frustration. "But I'm not the one who's made things difficult." Helen stared at her, her chest tight with emotion. She had expected this. Expected Madison to play the victim, to act like everything she'd done was for Ethan's best interest. "Of course you're not," Helen replied, her tone laced with irony. "You're just doing what you've always done, taking without ever giving. But I'm done. I'm done trying to make you see me. I'm done trying to fit into your perfect little world." For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if the tension had finally broken, Madison turned to leave, her footsteps echoing in the hallway. Helen stood in the middle of the room, her heart heavy. She hadn't expected this confrontation, but now that it was over, she felt an odd sense of clarity, like something she had been carrying for years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. As the door closed behind Madison, Helen let out a shaky breath and sank into the couch. She had crossed a line, but she wasn't sure if it was the right one. Was this the moment she had been waiting for? Was she finally standing up for herself, or had she just pushed Ethan away for good? Her phone buzzed, and she jumped. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. For the first time in weeks, her heart raced with both hope and dread. Could this be the moment he finally reached out? Or was this just another chapter in a story she couldn't control? What would you do if you were Helen, knowing everything you've sacrificed, and still facing the choice of standing your ground or letting go completely? Helen pressed accept and waited. And then, as she heard Ethan's voice on the other end of the line, she realized she was about to find out whether the cost of standing her ground was worth the pain it might bring. Helen held the phone tightly in her hand, the weight of it pressing into her palm, but not nearly as much as the weight pressing into her chest. Ethan's voice crackled through the speaker, tentative, unsure. "Mom, I need to talk." Her heart clenched, a mixture of fear and hope flooding her veins. She had waited for this moment for weeks, but now that it was finally here, she didn't know whether to brace herself or to listen with open arms. She swallowed hard. The words she had been preparing for so long caught in her throat. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice steady, "I've been waiting for you to call." There was a long pause, and for a second she thought he might hang up, that the silence between them might stretch on forever. But then his words came, hesitant and slow. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry, I've been avoiding you. It's just, everything's been so complicated, and I didn't want to make it worse. I didn't want you to think that I was choosing Madison over you." Helen's throat tightened, but she couldn't let herself cry now. Not yet. Not when she had waited this long to hear him say those words. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she asked quietly. "Why didn't you let me in, Ethan? I spent my whole life making sure you had everything you needed, making sure you felt loved and supported. I did that for you, for us. And now, all of a sudden, I'm just supposed to step aside like I'm nothing but a ghost in your life." She could hear him take a deep breath. "I didn't know how," he said, the words barely audible. "I didn't know how to make everyone happy. I didn't know how to choose between you and Madison, and I didn't want to hurt anyone." Helen closed her eyes, the ache in her chest expanding, but she wouldn't let him see her cry. She had cried enough for all of them, enough to fill a lifetime. "I wasn't asking you to choose, Ethan," she said, her voice breaking only slightly. "I just wanted to be part of your life. I wanted to be your mother on your wedding day, not a spectator. I've given you everything I have. I just wanted to feel like I mattered. That's all." Ethan didn't respond right away, and in that silence, Helen could almost feel him growing up right before her eyes. He was no longer the boy she had raised, the one who had clung to her for comfort and love. He was a man now, standing at the threshold of his own life, unsure of how to bridge the gap between who he was and who he was becoming. Finally, he spoke again, his voice thicker now, as if he were choking on the emotions he hadn't been able to express. Mom, I messed up. I see that now. I see how much I hurt you, how much I shut you out, and I can't take it back. But I want you to know that it wasn't about you. It was about me trying to make everything perfect and forgetting what really matters. There was a long pause, and then, I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know if I can fix this, but I want to try. Helen's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't enough. The apology wasn't enough. She had wanted so much more. She had wanted to hear him say that he understood what he had done, that he had realized the weight of her love and sacrifice. But this was a start, and maybe that was all she could ask for. I've been waiting for you to say that, Ethan, she whispered, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. But don't you ever forget, I didn't need an apology to love you. I needed you to see me, to see all that I've given and all that I am, not just as your mother, but as someone who has always been there for you. There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, Helen thought she might have lost him again. But then he spoke, his voice cracking slightly. I see you, Mom. I really do, and I'm sorry it took me this long. Helen didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell him it was okay, that everything would be fine, but it wasn't. Not yet. The wound was still too fresh. Instead, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything she had kept inside for so long. Can we start over? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's answer came quickly, his relief almost palpable. Yeah, Mom, we can start over. The call ended with a quiet promise hanging in the air between them. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a beginning. A week passed before Helen saw Ethan again. He showed up at her door one evening, looking worn, older than she remembered, as if the weight of the past few months had taken its toll on him. He held out a small envelope, his hands shaking slightly. This is for you, he said, his voice hoarse. I know it's not enough, but I thought it was a start. I want to make things right. Helen took the envelope, her fingers brushing his, and opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph of Ethan as a child, grinning up at her with that toothless smile that had once been the center of her world. And beneath it, in Ethan's handwriting, for you, Mom, always. Tears blurred Helen's vision as she looked at the photo, at the boy who had once needed her more than anything in the world, and then the man who had lost sight of that. I thought I had to do this alone, she said quietly, almost to herself. I thought I had to carry this burden alone. Ethan stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to lean into him, to let him hold her, to let herself be held. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered again. I'm really sorry. The apology was there, but it was more than that. It was the quiet, unspoken understanding that had been missing for so long. It was the acknowledgement that their love, despite the pain, was still strong enough to bridge the gap between them. The days that followed were not easy. They had to rebuild what had been broken, piece by fragile piece. But Helen was no longer afraid of the silence, no longer afraid to let go of the things that no longer served her. She had finally found her own strength again. She had found the power in her boundaries, in her ability to walk away when necessary, to stand her ground without apology. In time, Ethan and Madison's wedding came and went, and though Helen wasn't involved in the planning as she had once hoped, she found her own peace in the moments that mattered. She stood at the back of the ceremony, watching Ethan exchange vows with Madison, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like a mother watching her son take the next step in his life, his love for her no longer held hostage by anyone else's expectations. And though their paths would never be the same as they once were, Helen knew that the love she had given was enough. It had always been enough. As the reception wound down and people began to leave, Ethan came over to her, his arm around Madison's waist. I'm sorry again, Mom, he said softly. You were right. You've always been right. I just didn't know how to see it. Helen smiled, a bittersweet look in her eyes. It's okay, Ethan. It always was. And as the evening came to a close, Helen realized that in the end, she hadn't just helped them get through the day. She had learned to help herself. And that in itself was the most powerful thing she could have done. What do you think about the journey Helen went through? Can forgiveness truly heal the deepest wounds, or is there always a price to pay? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, leave a 100 in the comments to let us know. Where are you watching from? Feel free to share with your friends. And thank you for supporting the Life Stories channel.